Hello everyone, and welcome to a webinar that the Community Ownership Fund Support Programme has organised to help applicants to understand subsidy control. The COF Support Programme is delivered by 10 community support organisations as the Department of Levelling Up Homes and Communities official delivery partner. Next slide, please. My name is Zoe Goddard and I am the Programme Manager, and we are 10 leading organisations that have come together. Between us, we cover the whole UK and cover a deep knowledge base and experience of working with organisations delivering a range of community assets. Next slide, please. The support programme is helping applicants to the Community Ownership Fund in a number of ways. There are useful resources, including webinars about how to write a strong application, and these can be found on the My Community website. On the My Community website, there's also a form that you can submit queries to us through our advice service. There are also packages of in-depth support available to assets located in areas of highest need, which have a good strategic fit for the COF programme. Please go to the My Community website for more information on this. So, after receiving queries from a number of groups about subsidy control, the Community Ownership Fund Support Programme decided to enlist the help of Anthony Collins Solicitors to help groups to understand their subsidy position better. So I'd therefore now like to hand over to Gail Monk from Anthony Collins, who will be delivering this webinar today.
Thank you so much, Zoe, for the introduction, and thank you for having me. So as Zoe's described, we're here to talk about subsidy control today. My main ambition will be that you don't all fall asleep by the end of this presentation. Zoe's already given me a lovely introduction, so I won't dwell on the big picture of me on your slide now. Only suffice to say that post-COVID, none of us really look like that anymore, do we? But I'm Gail Monk, I'm a legal director at Anthony Collins, and I spend my time advising on procurement and subsidy control, both from the side of the sort of the grant applicant and from the side of the funding body in both cases. And have advised over the last couple of years mainly on things like the Community Ownership Fund, on other funds like the Youth Investment Fund, and the various decarbonisation funds that there are coming out of government at the moment. So really looking forward to sort of walking you through some of the tenets of subsidy control law. And I never thought I'd say I'd be excited about subsidy control, but there you go. So just sort of a few introductory comments before I get into the real meat of this. It's important first to explain that compliance with subsidy control rules is quite nuanced, and it will depend on the individual facts of the project that you are seeking funding for. The idea behind this webinar today is to give you a sort of an oversight and introductory view of the main principles of subsidy control rules and how they might apply to you. But recognizing that it's not a complete guide, and there might be information in this presentation that doesn't feel relevant in your particular circumstances, and there are other things that you might feel you want more information on. There will be situations where you need to obtain independent legal advice, or to go out and look for further detailed support in terms of the statutory guidance that there is available and things like that, if you're unsure of anything that comes out of this. With that having said, that big disclaimer to start us off, what we're aiming to cover in this session is the essentials of the subsidy control rules, what they are, how they work, and particularly the routes to compliance that you might have available to you, so that you can comply with those rules, specifically for projects funded through the Community Ownership Fund. So really hoping to make it quite specific to the types of things that you might be applying for funding for. So I'm going to start off then by sort of asking the most obvious question is, well, what on earth is subsidy control? Subsidy control is the name given to the rules that regulate and provide oversight of financial assistance that's provided from public funds, from the public sector, to what's known as enterprises. And I'll come back to some of the concepts in there in a minute. The law behind this now is set out in the Subsidy Control Act 2022. So us as lawyers, we've had some lovely new law to get to grips with over the last couple of years. The intention behind these rules is to ensure that public money is used in a way that benefits the public interest, so that public funds aren't misappropriated and used in inappropriate ways. The intention is to protect fair competition in the UK and protect against distorting open marketplaces. For most of the country, they replace the old European state aid laws across the UK post-Brexit. I will pick up some questions later on about what that means for Northern Ireland in particular. So the first question really to ask is, why does this matter? And the key thing from the applicant's perspective is that the application form for the Community Ownership Fund includes some very specific questions around subsidy control. And you're going to need to answer these as part of completing that application. So the first question, and I will come back to this in some detail, is, does the project meet the definition of a subsidy? And they've sort of linked you to the relevant part of the Subsidy Control Act 2022. We'll come back to that question of what a subsidy is and the detail of that definition. If it is a subsidy, you're then asked to explain how you think that the grant that you're applying for from the fund can be provided in a way which is in compliance with that act. And you've got 500 words to give that. They're suggesting here that this is measured by the 7 common principles that are laid out in the schedule to the act. And I'll come back to those 7 common principles in a little bit. And the last questions that they ask are specific to Northern Ireland. They ask, is your project based in Northern Ireland? And particularly if you are in Northern Ireland, do you think your project is going to comply with state aid rules? And there is specific government guidance about applying state aid rules alongside subsidy control rules if you're in Northern Ireland. So I said I'd come back to the idea of what is a subsidy. This is covered in Section 2 of the Subsidy Control Act 2022, which gives a detailed definition of what a subsidy is. And it means financial assistance, which is given directly or indirectly from public resources by a public authority. It confers an economic advantage on one or more enterprises. It is specific, that is, it is such that it benefits one or more enterprises over one or more other enterprises with respect to the production of goods or the provision of services. And then the last limb, it has or is capable of having an effect on competition or investment within the United Kingdom, trade between the United Kingdom and a country or territory outside the UK, or investment between the United Kingdom and a country or territory outside the United Kingdom. So the first thing I'd want to stress here is that these are what I call and tests rather than or tests. For something to be a subsidy, it needs to meet all of those limbs, A, B, C, and D, rather than just one of them. And I'm going to look at some of these in more detail than others, but just sort of to glance over them very briefly, to look at these in turn. That first limb, A, in the case of the Community Ownership Fund, this is always going to be funding given directly from public resources by a public authority. This is at its heart a fund provided by a central government department. In terms of B, this will depend on whether or not the person who's applying for the grant counts as what is called an enterprise. And I'll come back to that in some detail in a moment. If you are an enterprise, it is likely, given the way the grant funding programme is set up, that you will meet limb C. So the funding will benefit you as an enterprise in priority over another enterprise who hasn't received the grant, but is doing similar things in a similar marketplace to you. And in terms of D, this is, from a lawyer's perspective, a very, very low bar. In terms of being able to identify whether or not the grant has or is capable of having an effect on competition or investment or trade between nations, the expectation is that the majority of subsidy is going to be capable of having an effect on one of those limbs. It is generally safest to assume that this test is met. So the limb then that I want to come back and give a little bit more attention to is limb B, conferring an economic advantage on one or more enterprises. The first thing to say is that in terms of whether you are an enterprise, whether you are undertaking economic activity, It is not relevant what type of entity you are. It's well established through previous European state aid law and now subsidy control law that it doesn't matter what sort of corporate form you are or what sort of organisation you are. So a charity can be an enterprise, a local authority can be an enterprise. If you're non-profit, you can still be an enterprise. You can still be undertaking economic activity. And the real thing here is that it's the goods or services on the marketplace, the activity that you are undertaking, which is pertinent to whether you are considered an enterprise or not what type of entity you are. The other thing to say here is that you can be an enterprise in the context of some of your activities and not others. So looking at this test in Section 7 of the Act, an enterprise is a person who is engaged in an economic activity that involves offering goods or services on a marketplace. And as I say, it's to the extent that the person is engaged in such an activity. So you can be an enterprise where you are engaging in economic activity, but not classified as an enterprise for others of your activities. And the second limb there, paragraph B, is just saying actually it can be a person or a group of persons that is considered an enterprise depending on the circumstances. Paragraph 2 there seems slightly odd in the way it's wording, but it is trying to give clarity to this. An activity is not economic activity to the extent that it's carried out for a purpose that is not economic. So you can look at an activity and say, well, actually, normally this would be offering goods or services on a marketplace. We are running a shop, we're selling things, we're offering goods on a marketplace, for example. But if you were to do something similar, which was the same activity, but which not economic, didn't involve the transfer of money, maybe you have a community shop, which is actually effectively a reuse shop. You know, you're putting things out for not for sale, but for gift, then that may not be considered economic activity. And then limb 3 there probably isn't going to come up in the context of any of your applications, but it's saying that whether it's a person or a group of persons, they're not considered to be a separate enterprise because they're a shareholder or shareholders in a separate entity, which is an enterprise. So your involvement in another entity doesn't make you an enterprise. And just to clarify at the end there, when we talk about person, we're talking about what we call legal persons. So that includes companies, charities, partnerships, an unincorporated association like a sports club or something like that, rather than just an individual human being. So then just sort of flagging another thing out of the subsidy control rules, which is section 12. And I've headed this slide, who must comply with the subsidy control rules? Section 12 gives you an indication of how the subsidy control principles should be applied, and it says very clearly that a public authority must consider the subsidy control principles before they decide to give a subsidy, and must not give that subsidy unless that public authority is of the view that the subsidy is consistent with those principles. So it's worth highlighting that the primary responsibility for compliance with the subsidy control rules now rests with the public body, the public authority that is providing the grant, giving the assistance, the subsidy. So while you're being asked to provide your views within the context of the application form for the grant that you're seeking, ultimately it is DLUC's responsibility to identify a compliant route before giving the grant. So if you have concerns, I think there is scope to say, please do go back to DLUC to seek clarification, to have a conversation with them about what the route through to compliance is. Bearing in mind all of the routes to compliance I'm going to talk about in a moment. So in terms of what those routes to compliance might be, the route to compliance for you as an applicant for the fund will depend on the specifics of the funding that you're seeking and what the project is that you're seeking the funding for. But we do think that there are some likely routes that are going to apply to you that you'll want to think through in the context of answering those questions in the application form. And we're going to look at the most likely of these in a bit more detail. So the first is to identify where there is no subsidy. And in particular, if there is no, if you are not an enterprise because you're not undertaking any economic activity. If you do feel like you're undertaking some economic activities and so you will be an enterprise, and it's likely therefore that there will be a subsidy, there are then a few options you have to look at to consider which of these routes might help you comply with the subsidy control rules. The first is to follow the rules that apply to what's called minimal financial assistance, and I'll go into that in some detail. The next, if you don't think you can comply with those rules, is to design the subsidy to be consistent with the subsidy control principles. Those are the 7 principles mentioned in the application form that I'll look at in some detail. And another one that might be relevant to a few of the applicants to the funding is to look at whether or not what you're trying to seek funding for is a service of public economic interest. So as I say, we're going to have a look at each of those in a bit of detail. So, as I say, the first way to make sure that your project is compliant is to avoid subsidy control happening in the first place. Some of the work that you may be applying for funding for may not fall under the subsidy control rules at all. And as I said, when we looked at the test, all of the elements of that definition of a subsidy need to be present for it to fall under the subsidy control rules. The key one of these that I think may not apply to all of you when you're applying for this funding is that idea of what economic activity is. So what means that you might be an enterprise. It's going to depend on the community asset that's the subject to the grant, the particular project that you're looking to fund. But just to sort of give some examples, and apologies, there's when we share the slides, we'll share a couple of different examples with you. But if, for example, one of the things that you can do under the Community Ownership Fund is to look for funding to maintain a site of historical significance or a cultural significance, there's every chance something like that would not be an economic activity if visitors aren't charged for attendance. So if you're in a situation where you're maintaining a historical site, people visit it for free, the funding is being used to maintain the site, and you're not seeking to income generate through the site, that's unlikely to be economic activity. And as such, there may be no subsidy in that context. As another example, which may be in a slightly grayer area, if you're using the grant to refurbish a community centre, there may or may not be a subsidy depending on whether the use of the community centre would be considered to be economic activity. And that might depend, for example, on the way that you use the community centre. If you charge for room hire, if you allow people to run paid for classes at the community centre, then there may be some economic activity. But if you are using the community centre in a free to use sort of way, perhaps you're a charity looking to use a community centre to help people in need and support them without there being a charge involved, and with it being something like that, that there may not be a market for those services, and that's why you're providing these services, then there's a chance that there may not be a subsidy because there's no economic activity. So it's going to depend on the use of that sort of centre. And then to come back out of the grey area, if you use the grant to run a community shop, then there's every chance there will be a subsidy because there is an economic activity involved. You're offering goods and services on a marketplace. There are other shops available. So there will be a subsidy because there is economic activity. It's also worth mentioning that, as I said before, those are and tests when we look at the subsidy control rules. And while limb 1 is always going to be ticked and limb 3 is always going to be ticked, the fourth limb, that effect on competition, I've said it's a very, very low bar, but it is worth thinking about in the context of your project, whether or not that bar is met, whether you do have an effect on competition or trade. So as I say, very specific to the circumstances of your project, but hopefully that gives you a steer as to what it might look like in each case. If you do decide that there is a subsidy, so if you've looked at it and you're saying, well, we're definitely running an economic activity here, we're going to count as an enterprise, then you need to start looking at how you comply with the subsidy control rules. So the first route that I want to look at in terms of how you might control is the idea, how you might comply, is the idea of what's called minimal financial assistance. And as I say, this is if there is a subsidy in the first place. The concept of minimal financial assistance, for anybody who's applied for funding under the old state aid rules, you'll know this as what's called the de minimis rules. And it's a similar principle and a similar threshold. The question here is that it is whether you fall within this and whether you can meet all the rules that you see on the slide. So an enterprise, we've now established that you're an enterprise, because if you're at this point, you've decided you are undertaking some economic activity, can be awarded up to £315,000 within a rolling period of 3 fiscal years. And this is because in this sort of context, the view is taken that the subsidy is so small as to really have no effect on the marketplace. Now, whether or not you can comply with that rule will depend on what other subsidy your organisation has received under the same rules or the previous de minimis equivalent under EU rules. That £315,000 is cumulative over that 3-year period. So it is adding up all of the small amounts of funding that you might have received or applied for within those rules. So it's anything from different sources for different reasons as well, that adds up to that total. And the really key thing to identify is that actually the moment you are over that threshold, all of the funding under that threshold is at risk of being treated as a subsidy. Not just when you get to £315,001. It's all of the £315,000. So it is worth maintaining good records of what funding you've applied for and received, and whether you've been asked to make a declaration under the minimal financial assistance rules. In the context of the Community Ownership Fund, if you're seeking to rely on these rules, you will be asked to and need to complete a minimal financial assistance declaration form, which confirms exactly how much exempt subsidy, if any, you have received in the relevant period. That's that rolling 3 years. So you will need to know what funding you've received over the last 3 years, and you'll need to know what of that funding needs to be included in that declaration form. This isn't, just to reassure you, all subsidy that you've ever received. If you've received funding that hasn't needed to adhere to the minimal financial assistance rules, if it's a larger amount where these rules weren't in contemplation, for example, then that's not going to count towards your total. So if you've had £1 million to build a new community centre, for example, then that's not going to fall under these rules, and you wouldn't need to declare it in the context of that declaration form. It's those smaller amounts of funding that have all fallen under that amount. So that's probably, I would suggest, the most likely route that you are going to experience for compliance with the subsidy control rules in the context of the Community Ownership Fund. But if you've obtained a number of different pots of funding over the last 3 years, and you know that actually overall in total they lead to more than £315,000, that's when you'll probably want to start thinking about the next route to compliance, which is to adhere to the subsidy control principles. Now, what's happening here at this point is effectively you and DLUC would be acknowledging, yes, there is a subsidy here being given, but we are confident that it is considered lawful rather than unlawful because it meets these core principles. So I'm going to go into these principles in a little bit more depth. Government has produced an incredibly useful template for a principles-based assessment, and when we share out the links to the slides and things, I'll make sure that there's a link included to that self-assessment, because it's very useful to run through, as it gives you a really clear steer as to what the commentary is that you need to give to identify that you're meeting each of these principles. So looking at those in a little bit more detail now. Step 1 on the assessment form is to identify the policy objective and to identify that subsidy is the appropriate route to meet that policy objective. So subsidy control principle A, that first principle, is to look at whether or not the subsidy is in the common interest, whether there is a policy objective behind it that means it's in the public interest to give this subsidy. And what the self-assessment template tells us is that you need to provide details of the specific policy objective. Those are generally going to be the policy and strategy objectives of the fund that you are seeking to apply to, the Community Ownership Fund here. So it's going to be deluxe policy objectives that they're trying to meet in administering this fund that you need to think about. You want to establish the existence and significance of the market failure that you are trying to address through seeking the funding. So if you're running a community shop, the market failure is actually there are no local shops here, and that the market isn't strong enough to enable somebody without a subsidy to deliver the same sort of provision in this place, or an inequality that the subsidy seeks to address. So again, in the context of, say, a sort of a community shop or a community pub, the inequality is that the market doesn't deliver a service to this area because perhaps it's too expensive to get goods into the area for a normal business, and perhaps the profit margin isn't high enough. And that leads to an inequality because you've got a community which is unable to obtain those services or goods. And then you need to identify how the subsidy will remedy the market failure. So how you're going to provide a better outcome by providing the subsidy than there would be without it. Or what the equity objective is that you're seeking to address. So, what's the inequality, as we described it, that you're going to rectify through using the subsidy. And then it can be helpful to state what the desired outcomes are. So again, using the example of a community shop, you say actually the desired outcome is an effectively run shop which serves the community, provides a vital service for potentially a remote area of the population. And it can be worth stating the sort of the wider social and environmental impact that can be had through delivering that sort of service as well. As I say, step 1 on this assessment also says that you need to think about the appropriateness of using subsidy as the right route. And this is actually, for all that it's contained in step 1 of the template, is principle 5 on your slide there, explaining why a subsidy is the least distortive means of achieving the policy objective. So you want to justify why the subsidy is the most appropriate instrument for addressing the policy objective you've set out, and why other routes aren't going to make sense. So, for example, looking at the community shop example again, the public sector isn't going to provide those goods or services itself, so direct provision by the public sector isn't an option. Commercial loans or equity investment on commercial terms isn't going to make any sense, because actually, if you've identified a market failure that privately run businesses aren't willing to open a shop in the area, you're not going to get a commercial loan to deliver the same outcome, because you wouldn't be able to get that on market terms. The template then moves on to step 2, which looks at the principles 3 and 4 on your slide. That the intention here is to identify what the subsidy is achieving or enabling you to achieve that you would not have achieved anyway. So there needs to be a comparison between the baseline, what would happen if you didn't obtain the subsidy, and in many of your cases that's going to be either, well, actually, we couldn't open this community shop, we couldn't save this community pub, we couldn't restore this historical artifact, something like that. Or alternatively, well, we could do this, but it's going to take us an awful lot longer, or we're going to do it on a much smaller scale without this funding. So your no subsidy scenario is the comparison with what you could do now without the funding as compared with what you would do with the funding. And that's built into step 2 as well, which is to identify the additionality, what the change in your behavior is, what the thing is that you're going to achieve with the funding that you wouldn't have done otherwise. And this is relative to that baseline, that no subsidy scenario. And the form asks you to provide details of how the subsidy will lead to a change in your economic behaviour and bring about something that would not have happened without the subsidy. And again, linking that back with those policy objectives, principle 1 being that sort of common interest, public interest test. Justifying within that whether if the subsidy is going to compensate you for costs that you would have likely funded anyway. So if you would have found the money from another means, you need to justify why you need the subsidy instead. So step 2, as I say, is really about identifying with principles 4 and 5 what you would have done without the funding and why this funding is so vital to having a different impact than you would have done otherwise. Step 3 then looks at principles 2 and 7 on the list here, which is 6 on the list here, which is about acting proportionately and minimizing the distortion to competition. And the template asks you to demonstrate how the subsidy that's being sought, how the grant you're applying for is proportionate and is designed to minimise the negative effects on competition and investment within the UK, while still allowing you to meet that policy objective. So here you're being asked to include details about what you've considered about how the subsidy control rules can be complied with in the context of the specifics of what you're applying for. So most of this is for DLUC to consider. The things that the self-assessment is asking for details on is the nature of the subsidy that's being given, the types of beneficiaries and the selection process that DLUC are imposing, the timescales and the nature of the funding that's going to be provided, and what performance criteria and monitoring and evaluation there are needed. So here I think you can comfortably assume that the grant terms and conditions that you're going to be asked to adhere to will cover most of these things and make sure that the subsidy is a proportionate response and the terms and conditions are being designed to minimise the negative effects on competition and investment. The last point here looks at point 7 on that list, that there needs to be a clear balancing exercise which sets out what the benefits of the subsidy are as compared with any negative effects that that subsidy might have. So this is effectively asking you to explain that the impact of the subsidy is significant enough that it outweighs any negative effects on competition and investment within the UK and on international trade and investment. That can look at whether there's an impact particularly on the area that the subsidy is being applied to and whether the shift in economic activity to that area is justifiable in terms of the wider impact that the subsidy will have. So if you are drawing activity from one town to another, from one county to another, something like that, that actually you can look at it. We often look at it in terms of where these are areas of deprivation or where there are significant needs within that area, that the policy objective of meeting those additional needs in that area, trying to address those areas of deprivation, those sorts of policy objectives will outweigh the effect that there is on competition as a result of moving that economic activity around. So I appreciate that that is a really swift whistle-stop tour through how the principles work, and you'll see from that how important it is to look at it in the context of your specific application. As I say, when we share the slides, we'll make sure that that self-assessment template goes out with it so that you can look at it, while recognizing that some of it will need to be thought about by DLUC alongside you as the grant applicant. So just then turning to one of the last possibilities that you might have, which in terms of how to make sure your project is compliant. And this is the idea of services of public economic interest and the assistance that can be given to these. So here, what we're describing as a service of public economic interest is the delivery of an essential service which it has been demonstrated is not adequately provided by the marketplace. So the examples that are given in the statutory guidance around this are things like postal services, social housing, rural transport networks, and childcare that's provided at sub-market rates. So this may be a factor for you if the thing that you are applying for funding for is to run a service rather than to offer goods on the marketplace. There are specific rules that apply to services of public economic interest. And my recommendation that it is that if you are getting to this point in the sort of the guidance, and you're saying to yourself, okay, well, I know I'm an enterprise, so I know I've got economic activity. I've looked at the minimal financial assistance rules, and I know I can't adhere to those because I've had more than £315,000 of funding up until this point. And I'm looking at the subsidy control principles, those 7 principles, and I'm looking at the self-assessment, and I'm needing a steer. I think I might also want to argue that this is a service of public economic interest. There is then specific detailed statutory guidance that applies to this, and I would recommend that this is the point at which you might want to seek specific advice to do with your particular application, if you think there's a chance that these rules are relevant. The benefit that this obtains is that you have a separate set of thresholds that are applied to services of public economic interest. You apply the subsidy control principles in a slightly different way, and you look at a different threshold for minimal financial assistance. So, as I say, it's slightly more complex, and I would only be looking at this if you're really not confident that the other routes to compliance can't be adhered to, or if you're seeking sufficient funding that you don't think the minimal financial assistance rules are going to help you. So just briefly, I wanted to pick up for those of you who are applying from Northern Ireland, what this looks like for you. And here the question is, okay, what on earth happens in Northern Ireland? So in Northern Ireland, you have to think about, as well as the subsidy control rules, the Northern Ireland Protocol, which is set out in Article 10 of what's now known as the Windsor Agreement. And the point here is that alongside subsidy control, European state aid rules will continue to apply to measures which affect trade in goods or the electricity market between Northern Ireland and the EU. So you're in the unfortunate position, in a way, of needing to think about both subsidy control and state aid rules. It's worth stressing that the state aid rules will not generally apply to subsidies for services unless, and this is felt to be very unlikely, but unless there is an indirect benefit to trade in goods. The rules are quite stringent as to what you need to have identified for this to be applicable. There needs to be a genuine and direct link to Northern Ireland. So this is going to be most relevant to those of you who are based in Northern Ireland and the community ownership, the community asset is in Northern Ireland that you're seeking to apply for funding for. There needs to be a real, foreseeable and material effect on the trade between Northern Ireland and the EU, which is not merely hypothetical. So there needs to be a very definite impact from the subsidy that you're seeking, the aid that you're seeking, on the effect the effect on the trade between Northern Ireland and the EU. Most likely, obviously, most probably this is going to apply to any of you who are applying for funding for from the fund, and you're on the border between Northern Ireland and the Republic. So say, for example, look, if you're trying to restore a community pub and you're on the border and you know full well that the next village over on the other side of the border has a pub, it's that type of scenario where you might go, actually, there is a real foreseeable and material effect on trade between Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland. And it's not merely hypothetical. You can identify what that effect would be. So you can see that actually this is now quite a high bar test before you need to think about the state aid rules. If you cannot identify that real foreseeable and material effect on trade, then you don't need to worry about the old European state aid rules. If you do think that there is a risk that there is this effect on trade, effectively the same contemplation is needed as is for the subsidy control rules that we've just rattled through. And you've got the same considerations to work through. So first of all, you think about, can you consider structuring what you're seeking so that there is no aid in the first place? If there is aid, and sorry, just to say, in terms of state aid, there is a similar cumulative test. They're an and test in terms of what state aid is, rather than in the same way as there is for subsidy control. So you have to meet all of the limbs of what's described as state aid in the same way as you do subsidy control. If you are in a position where you think there is state aid, then look at the de minimis rules in the same way as you would the minimal financial assistance rules that we've worked through. And if you're outside of the threshold for de minimis rules to apply, that's when you need to start looking at the general block exemption rules, which will depend entirely on what it is you're seeking to apply for funding for. But the general block exemptions are doing a similar thing to the 7 subsidy control principles now. They are identifying types of aid that the European Union has considered acceptable because the justification for the aid is demonstrated through those general block exemptions. So do think through those situations where you might need to apply to both sets of rules. These are really very much if you are seeking to apply a measure which is affecting trade in goods, as I say, not services, and you think the state aid rules are going to apply, you're then probably in a situation where you want to go out and seek specific support to identify how you can find a block exemption that's going to work for your project. And I wanted to finish with just a quick note on what the impact of non-compliance is, to ask the so what question. So as well as having started by saying, okay, why is this important? It's important because you're asked as part of the application to complete those questions to say whether you've got a subsidy, whether it's lawful or not. The reality is, if there is an unlawful subsidy, so just to reiterate, this is a subsidy that doesn't comply with those 7 principles, or that it doesn't rightly fit under the minimal financial assistance rules, you can be asked to pay it back. And if you are asked to pay it back, when those funds are recovered, that can be subject to interest, which is backdated to award. So that sounds very alarmist, but it's important to keep that in mind, that if you don't follow these rules and you don't comply with what you need to comply with to meet DLUHC's requirements, then there is a chance that you'll be made to return the funding that you've received, and that's subject to interest. The other thing is that subsidies can be challenged by competitors, by government bodies, and other interested parties. So you could be subject to litigation if there's somebody else who hasn't received the grant and feels that they're unhappy about the subsidy that you've obtained, or something like that. And litigation always comes with unpredictable costs. So if your subsidy is challenged, even if you were successful at the end of that, you still have costs and you've still lost time. So really important from that context as well to get it right first time. And the other thing is more of a grey area, less of a legal thing, but just to say that actually receiving an unlawful subsidy can lead to reputational damage for your organisation. If you're found, you've already been made to pay it back, but actually reputationally that has an impact for you as well. It could make it more difficult to apply for other funding in the future. And it can make make your life a bit more challenging given the reputation that leaves you with. So that's a rather fatalistic end to this this session, but it is important to identify what the impact is if you don't comply. The one that's not listed there, which is probably the most significant, which is that if you cannot identify a lawful route through the subsidy control rules, the likelihood is that you won't obtain the funding in the first place. So that's less dramatic, but obviously of equal importance and significance. So do take this seriously. Do think through the sort of the principles that I've provided there, and do think about how you can complete the questions in your application form to best effect, taking those principles into account. I'm then going to open up to questions, and I know that Zoe's going to tell me that she's obtained some questions in advance. I'm going to take us off slideshow, and so that you can see me and Zoe in the flesh, and we'll have a conversation and a chat through any questions that there have been. So first thing I need to do is take myself off. Well, turn my camera on, don't I? So. Sorry, this is taking a moment. There, that should be me on screen.
Great, thanks, Gail. That was really useful. So yeah, our advice service has received quite a few queries about subsidy
No doubt.
control.
Yeah.
So I'm going to pick a few of those out for you today. So the first one I'd like to ask is, please can you explain what the different types of financial assistance are? Because it isn't just grants
No,
from local
absolutely.
authorities and central government, is it?
No. So there can be lots of things that can count as financial assistance. Obviously, in the context of the Community Ownership Fund, people are applying for grant funding. So that's the thing that we focused on. But you're absolutely right. It's not just grants that we talk about. It's anything really that isn't on commercial market terms. So that can be a contract where you're not charging a market rate for something. So you're providing a service, but you're not charging what you would on the market price. You're offering a lower price. So effectively, or for that matter, you're offering a higher price and somebody's willing to pay over the odds for something. And that's effectively a type of financial assistance. It can be loans. Things like a loan that's not on market terms. You're offered a loan of some funding, but you're offered 1% as the interest rate on that loan, for example. And we all know 1% at the moment is not a commercial rate for a loan. And in that sort of circumstance, it can be a little bit more complicated to work out precisely what the subsidy is, because you are looking to identify effectively the difference between what market terms would look like and what the actual terms of what you're offering is. So if you're being offered a loan at a 1% interest rate, then the entire loan is not the funding, the subsidy. It's the difference between the interest rate that you're paying and the interest rate that you would pay on the market that's the subsidy. So the challenge with that type of financial assistance is working out precisely how much subsidy you're obtaining. But yes, absolutely, it is important to think through the different types of financial assistance that entities could be getting, not just grant funding. It can come up in the context of relationships with the public sector, for example, if you get a benefit in kind of some sort. So if a community asset is transferred to you and it's not at market value, it's at a peppercorn or something like that, then again, that can be a financial assistance. If you're given space in somebody's offices, which isn't paid for under a lease, that can be a financial assistance because you're getting a benefit in kind. So again, some of those things can be quite hard to quantify what the subsidy is, but it is important to identify them as subsidy.
Yeah. So if an organisation has had an asset transfer within the last 3 years, it's the value of the discount that would need to be included.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yes, absolutely.
Okay, great. Thank you for that. Another question is, one of the 4 limbs to decide if it is a subsidy or not is about whether the grant is capable of having an effect on competition. We are the only pub in our village, and the nearest pub is 5 miles away, and it serves another village. Would a community ownership fund grant for purchasing the pub and undertaking essential refurbishments have an effect on competition, and so therefore count as a subsidy?
So yeah, this is a really interesting one to work through actually, because I mean I sort of mentioned in the main presentation that I think that of the 4 tests, the ones that you're most going to want to give thought to are that question of whether or not you're an enterprise in the first place, but then also whether or not you've got an effect on competition. As I say, that is a really low bar. Under old state aid rules, it was very clear that you had to be really quite remote and quite separate from any other economic activity for it to not have an effect on competition. But there were always arguments about something that was really intended to be wholly local and solely local, that would potentially not have an effect on competition. Some of the examples that used to be given under old state aid rules would be things like a hairdresser that served a village, and there were no other hairdressers in the area and no other competition in the area, or a pool. One of the key cases that we always used to work with was a swimming pool that was not intended for sort of to draw tourism in or to bring visitors from outside of the area, but it was purely for local interest. So there are examples where you could say, actually, no, we don't think we have an effect on competition. it is going to depend entirely on the circumstances. But in that example of you're the only pub in the village, the nearest next village along which has a pub is maybe 5 miles away. You've got to think through, I think, how much overlap there is currently between the people who go to each of those pubs, the amount of sort of turnover that each pub gets from the same audience, to identify whether there is any competition. It may be that you're looking at it and it's remote enough where you go, actually, no, there is no crossover between these two villages. They don't overlap at all. Nobody would ever contemplate going to the pub in the next village along, or nobody from the next village along would contemplate coming to this pub. You would need to be really confident in that to provide that as an argument. But yes, it is a very, very low bar, but there is still a bar to be hit there. There needs to be something real. I think it comes out in that slide about the Northern Ireland situation in terms of state aid, that what state aid rules always said was actually it needs to be genuinely foreseeable, not merely hypothetical. And I think the same argument you could use here. Actually, it's not just a hypothetical impact on competition. There needs to be something genuine that you could identify as having an impact.
Okay, thank you. If we're looking at using the minimum financial assistance exemption, how do I determine what financial assistance my organisation has had over the past 3 years? So where do I go and look to understand which might need to be added up as part of that calculation?
Okay, crikey, this can be hard. It absolutely can. It's going to depend on how good your record keeping is as an organisation when you're applying for the funding. And it's helpful actually talking about this after we've said, actually, when we talk about financial assistance, we're not just talking about grants, because that's probably the most straightforward bit of it. You know, you're going to know most likely what grant funding you've obtained over the last 3 years, because hopefully you've got some paperwork, you've got an application form, you've got a grant funding agreement, something like that, and you've got bank records of having obtained the money and so on. So the grant funding can be the most straightforward thing to identify. And for most people, that's going to be the most significant, probably, in terms of the pots of assistance that they'll be obtaining that they need to disclose. Hopefully then as well, some of the other financial assistance, for all that it can be harder to quantify, should still be obvious. You know, you should know if you're leasing premises at less than market rent. And if you're not sure, hopefully you can find some sort of comparators within the local area to work out what market rent would look like. You know, so have a quick Google, have a look at, okay, you know, what does office space cost in my area? How does that compare to the rent that I'm paying for this room in a set of offices that the local council's giving me at the moment? And identify from that whether there's any financial assistance. Hopefully, one of the most straightforward ways that you can identify this is because you've had to fill in a minimum financial assistance declaration in the past. So you look at those declarations, you keep them on your records and go back and sift through them. We're still within the timescale where if you've had any funding or assistance under state aid de minimis rules, that might be relevant as well. So think about whether over the last 3 years you've got the tail end of any state aid, any funding, any assistance that's had to meet those rules, because that will be relevant as well. So there may be a bit of digging through your paperwork to do to identify precisely what financial assistance you've had. If you're relatively confident that you're well under the threshold, I think you can probably be a bit more relaxed. You know, I think where you're going to want to give it a bit more scrutiny is if you're up towards the 315,000 and you're concerned about whether or not you're going to tip over that threshold.
Yep. And in terms of grants, it's about looking at the grant agreements, isn't it, to see if that's mentioned.
Yeah, absolutely.
Because there are lots of grants out there from like charitable foundations that are not going to be subsidies. So it's looking at things like public funding, lottery funding.
Yeah, so any lottery funding does count as subsidy because it's considered ultimately to come from the public sector. But yes, you're absolutely right. It's not all grant funding. You may have had funding from charities that are confident that it's coming from public donations, for example, or from legacies that they have. So it's not public money, so it doesn't hit that subsidy test. And the other thing to look at any other previous grant agreements about is whether it's identified in those grant agreements whether it was under the minimum financial assistance rules or not, or whether there was either another exemption from state aid rules, or it was a principles-based assessment when it comes to subsidy. Because if it's not fallen under those rules in that grant, you don't need to look at it here.
Right. Okay, great. Thank you. And sort of related, another question related to this, we have an existing services contract in place with a local authority under which we provide services for a fee. Will that need to be counted towards the MFA limit?
Right, good question. So generally, I would say no. The majority, if it's a services contract with a public body, the majority of those would need to fall under the local authority's contract procedure rules, and they need to follow procurement processes, whether it's a high value and the public contracts regulations apply, or a low value and they're following their own internal rules. Either set of rules will generally identify that they have to demonstrate that they are working on market terms, because they need to demonstrate that they're getting value for money. So if you've been through any sort of competitive exercise to tender to provide that service for a fee, then that is generally going to identify that you don't have any economic advantage from that contract. Because market terms are being exercised. So you've got a service that you're providing for a fee. That fee is competitive with the marketplace. There's no subsidy being given. So at that point, no, you wouldn't need to count that towards the MFA limit. It would only be if you weren't confident that that service was being provided on market terms for a sort of a competitive rate that you'd need to question whether or not there was a subsidy there.
Okay, great. Thank you. If my organisation is over the MFA threshold, how would we, as a typical community centre type project, meet the 7 subsidy principles?
Okay, so I sort of rattled through really quickly, I know, the self-assessment tool that government's provided, but I think that's the tool that you want to use to work this through. And just sort of thinking about that in terms of community centre, I would start by going back to the DLUC prospectus and for the My Community support that you're being offered to identify sort of the policy objectives that you're meeting through doing this, and that, because like I say, those are DLUC's policy objectives in providing this fund as a whole that you're seeking to meet. And think about those in the context of your particular community centre. Are you in an area where actually these community facilities are just not provided, and the reason why you're seeking this funding is to provide something that just isn't available in your area, for example, so that you can say, well, there is a market failure. The market does not provide these facilities in our area or at all across the country, either way. And we're trying to meet that policy objective that DLUC has of supporting community ownership of assets and the sort of the maintenance and protection of those community assets. Generally, kind of looking through those subsidy control principles, the other part of that step with the policy is to identify why it needs to be a grant, a subsidy rather than some other mechanism. And I think that's generally quite straightforward. For the likes of a community centre, you're really unlikely to get a commercial loan to provide you with the funding that you'd need to pay back, because you're looking at a community facility which is never going to generate the surplus, the profit, if you like, to enable you to pay back a commercial loan. So there is a good reason why you're looking for the financial assistance in this route rather than going out and trying to get investment in a commercial context. And then I would work through the rest of that self-assessment to go, okay, what's the situation if I don't apply for this funding? What can I achieve without it? What would I achieve anyway? If you have some funding already, for example, you might be saying, well, we have this funding, we can open the community centre, but we're only going to be able to keep it open 3 days a week if we don't have this additional funding. Or actually, we're not going to be able to refurbish and maintain an extra limb, an extra room. You want to be able to identify what you would do if there wasn't the funding in place, as compared with what you would do, what's the extra that you'll add because this funding is available to you. So if you get the funding, this is what you're going to achieve. You're going to open the community centre and it's going to be open 7 days a week, or it's going to have you're going to have a caretaker employed, and that's going to mean the facilities you can offer are of a better quality and can serve a wider audience, or simply that actually you will get the community centre open quicker and make it available to the community in a way that you couldn't do otherwise. There will be some cases where the answer there is, well, it just won't happen at all if we don't have this funding. And that is, that can be the most black and white example of here's your baseline, here's what it looks like without a subsidy, as compared to here's what it looks like with a subsidy. But in each case, you're looking to articulate what it is extra that you're going to achieve because you're obtaining the funding. What's the extra that you do on top of what you would have done otherwise?
Okay.
And yeah, so the self-assessment tool is really, really useful, and I'd really encourage you to sort of work through it. There will be questions that DLUC would need to answer, but it does give you this really nice tool to identify how you're going to meet those subsidy control principles.
Great. And a lot of projects are going to have a funding mix of loan and grant. So in
Yeah.
that case, is it a case of saying we can only service this size of loan? Here's our,
Yeah.
cash flow forecasts and viability analysis to back that up.
Absolutely.
And
Yeah.
therefore there's a funding gap that we're
Yeah,
going to cough
absolutely.
to fund the rest.
And that can really help in those contexts where it's a mixture of loan or match funding and the grant funding. That can be really helpful in terms of articulating why this is an appropriate measure to take, and why this is proportionate, because you're saying, well, actually, we're deviating from market terms as little as possible. We're taking out a loan to the extent that we can. We just need that little bit extra rather than trying to take the entirety of it in grant funding, for example. So that can really help that argument about actually why this is an appropriate route, the right type of financial assistance to meet those policy objectives. That can really help.
Great. Okay, thank you. And very sort of similar question. Our project will undertake essential repairs to a sports pavilion. Our sports club will be over the threshold, the MFA threshold. How, again, can we answer the question about meeting those 7 subsidy principles?
Okay. So this is similar, but obviously, yes, different context. So you're going to look at those policy objectives, and it's going to be a different thought process about how you're meeting them. In the context of a sports pavilion, you're going to have the community focus that a community centre might have, but you've also you might be looking at a slightly different context of sort of health and well-being, and the impact that providing sports facilities within a community could have. So you're going to look at those policy objectives again and go, okay, here's what I'm really doing through providing this, and improving the facilities in the area, and actually what the sports club is going to offer. So it can be helpful to articulate what sort of provision you'll have once the sports club has received the funding. Are there outreach programs to young people? Are there what are the specific policy objectives that you can say, well, yes, we're really ticking this? It's about the health and well-being of local people. It's about providing access to sports and other activities to an audience that wouldn't otherwise have that ability. And then running through that analysis again to go, okay, what could we achieve without the financial assistance, and how does that compare to what we can do afterwards? If you're talking about essential repairs, you're probably talking about a situation where you're saying, well, actually the sports pavilion is going to have to close down if we don't get this funding. There are then things that we will not be able to do. We won't have anywhere to store our kit. We won't be able to host teams from outside the area if you're playing sports. So articulate, actually, without this funding, this is what the situation looks like. And I'd encourage people to be really quite stark about that. It'd be truthful, but to say, actually, really bluntly, this is what the situation looks like if we cannot make these repairs, if we can't reopen the pavilion, and compare that with what the picture would look like with the funding. These are the types of things we're going to be able to deliver because of the funding, and this is why we can't do it on market terms. We've been able to obtain a loan for part of this in the same way, or we've obtained sponsorship from local businesses, and that's brilliant, but it's not quite getting us there. We need this as well. We need that mixed economy of financial assistance to be able to achieve what we want to achieve.
Brilliant. Okay. That's great. Thanks a lot. I think leave it there in terms of the questions. So yeah, just like to say thanks again. That presentation's really helped me to understand it better. So I know it's going to
Great.
help lots of groups applying to the Community Ownership Fund to help answer those questions in the application form. So yeah, thanks very much for that, Gail. And just like to say before we finish today that there are lots of resources available on the My Community website to help groups apply to the Community Ownership Fund. We've got other webinars about how to write a strong application, how to secure match funding. We've got lots of frequently asked questions on there. There's also a Word version of the online COF application form, which is really handy for drafting your questions, for saving your questions, and then doing consultation with your board around what you want to put in the application. And then on My Community, there's lots of other resources around community assets, community asset transfer, and generally about lots of things to do with community ownership. So please have a look at My Community. You'll also find the form there for our advice service as well. So please have a look on that website if you can. But yeah, thanks again for listening, everyone. Thanks again, Gail.
Brilliant. It's a pleasure. Thank you so much.
Thanks. Bye, everyone.
Bye.